She has been very active. She has written a lot. You may have seen some of her work in the public eye, talking about the very topic she will talk about tonight. She has done graduate teaching. She has done library information work. She has been a tutor in some neighborhood schools in the Chicago area. And she was designated as the Michael A. Carroll Memorial Award winner for her commitment to community development planning from a neighborhood and governmental perspective. And she continues to write, and she continues to research. It is such a treat to have her with us tonight to talk about the Shack studies some 50 years later. Please help me welcome Natalie Prochaska.
Thank you so much, Barb. I really appreciate the introduction. It's also really special for me to be here today. Thank you so much for having me, League of Women Voters of Champaign County. Really excited to be here. I've developed a lot of respect for the work that you guys do in the community as a result of some of the learning and the research that I did during my master's program. I first met Barb when I was 13 years old at uni, learning about Gilgamesh and how to make precocious teenage boys be quiet and actually learn history, which was a really amazing accomplishment for that particular cohort of boys. So, woman of many talents. As Barb mentioned, I recently completed my master's in urban planning at U of I, where I worked with a professor from my department, Andrew Greenlee, who studies housing mobility research and the effects on families of forced moves as a result of foreclosure and processes like eminent domain. As part of my master's research assistant job with him, I began talking with Bristol Place residents, which is a neighborhood in North Champaign that's undergoing a redevelopment process right now as part of his research. He was interested in interviewing homeowners and renters in this area to understand how they were being affected by the redevelopment plan that the city of Champaign was moving forward with. One of the stories that stuck with me and one of the interviews that really impacted me and my thesis and my kind of direction in life so far recently was an older couple that I spoke with as part of his research who the husband had worked for the railroad for over 30 years, saved up enough money, and him and his wife put their entire life savings in a small plot of land and the adjacent lot. They lived there for 40 years, raised their kids. They called it a quiet, peaceful corner lot with plenty of space. As the city moved forward with the eminent domain process and acquiring properties, the city offered him only $10,000 more than what he had paid for the land 40 years ago that his house sat on, and exactly the same amount that he had paid for the adjacent lot 40 years ago, despite the fact that he had built, he had made many improvements. They'd expanded their house by maybe 40%. He built 3 sheds, he built a fence, invested his life savings. The feelings that they shared with me were feelings of anger, sadness, and helplessness. She said, "I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life here." She fell and had just recently broken her hip when I spoke with them, so they were kind of in the middle of also dealing with, healthcare nonsense. He said, "We're too old to get a new mortgage." And at the end of the interview, all I could do was say, "Thank you so much for talking with me. I have a $20 gift card. Thanks for your time." That experience, among others, I interviewed a number of residents in the neighborhood who had similar stories, made me want to understand how these families and people ended up in this position, why the city decided that they needed to use eminent domain to evict everyone in the neighborhood and demolish every home in the neighborhood before redeveloping the whole area. So my respect for the League of Women Voters of Champaign County grew out of my learning process behind trying to answer these questions. Specifically with the 5 reports that were prepared over a period of 2 decades in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. That basically documented the absolutely abysmal housing and human conditions in the North End. The first one that I, again, was very kind of emotionally impacted by was the shack study, which many of you probably know, from 1949. This report detailed the poor construction, the poor neighborhood services, and the poor life quality and opportunity for people in that neighborhood. Quote, "The area is not beautiful. Streets are unpaved and sidewalks at a premium. The mean little shacks are strangely haphazard and ugly. The yards teeming with litter. Stagnant pools of water lie underfoot. The privies, doorless, send out their stench, and everywhere mud lies thick." This report talked about the poor construction of the houses. In 1953, 2 local children were killed in a shack fire because the structure burned so fast they couldn't get out. No insulation, no enforcement of code. There were unpaved streets and no sewage disposal or garbage collection. Unpaved streets get muddy and garbage collecting trucks are heavy. So the garbage collectors, the private garbage collectors, refused to go collect garbage in the area. The League of Women Voters at the time put together reports from social workers, interviewed social workers in the area, who noted tensions in families living under these conditions, as well as lowered physical stamina and spread of disease. The next report that I looked at was from 1951, Public Housing and Slum Clearance in Champaign-Urbana. The League reported that the city ordinances that were supposed to prohibit this kind of neglect were not enforced in the North End. Both Urbana and Champaign had regulations for the construction and maintenance of outhouses, for example, but neither had inspection requirements to ensure compliance. The League identified the primary reasons for these conditions as poor building construction, high population density, overcrowding, poor streets, and lack of utilities. They said there should be attacks from 3 angles: the provision of low rent housing, the elimination of the worst housing conditions, and the prevention of new slums. Slum conditions can be eliminated through the enforcement of existing ordinances on nuisances, health, and safety. The League further reported in this Public Housing and Slum Clearance report from 1951 that not only were the offices of the building inspectors understaffed and neighbors unwilling to make complaints, but in the absence of routine inspection or complaints from others, many violations, particularly in the poorer neighborhoods, go undetected, and public opinion, unfortunately, did not support enforcement. Not enforcing city codes and ordinances is one of the ways that Champaign's local government contributed to the creation of the blighted conditions that old urban renewal in the 60s was supposed to solve. Fast forward to urban renewal in the 60s, when current League members Louise Allen, Margaret Stewart, and Liza Goldwasser, who I had the privilege to meet and talk with last month at the Urbana Free Library Archives that Barb mentioned, when these 3 women were just getting involved with the League. So I had no idea before talking with them, but the history of this local chapter is a history of amazing women doing really powerful, really important work here locally. I didn't learn a lot of local history as a kid growing up here. I don't know why that is, but this was really an important conversation for me, and this learning that I've done in the last couple of years about our local history has been really important, and the League has played a central role in that. Marianne Ferber, fierce fighter for women in economics, feminist labor economist, and practical academic. Jane Bardeen, wife of 2-time Nobel Prize winner in physics, John Bardeen. Ruth Elmy, wife of the head of the physics department. Gretchen Starr, wife of the head of the classics department. Susan Stone, president of this League's chapter in '67, and a founding faculty member at Parkland. I learned some amazing history. I didn't know that women couldn't get jobs at U of I because of nepotism laws, and that the wives of these faculty members, who also had a lot of them PhDs and advanced degrees, worked at Parkland. And one of the reasons that Parkland is such a world-class institution is because of the work that this organization, and maybe some of you in this room, did. So they told me that the League was instrumental in passing community college funding legislation in Illinois, too. So Liza told me that she was appalled when she first arrived in Champaign at the conditions in the North End. And Margaret Stewart actually experienced the poor conditions in the North End herself in the summer of 1966 when she dropped her 2 daughters off at a birthday party. She said it took a really long time to get to the house because of the lack of street connections, so she had to take a really winding, circuitous route. Her 2 daughters remembered dirt floors, doorways but no doors, and it being very dark. They raved afterwards about what a great time they'd had, but noticed and took note of the starkly different conditions from their own home. 1965, a report to the membership, Champaign Urban Renewal. So this is where my thesis, I was kind of focusing on renewal, and then I ended up going back further because I realized that there was a lot of other really amazing material here. The League's Committee on Housing and Urban Renewal stated, to expect the City Council to go further, to commit more funds for more staff and redevelopment, to confront issues of citywide equal opportunity. We must be willing to support them and to help elicit the cooperation of the whole community. The program will fail unless the citizens of the community are actively interested in its success. It needs their personal support. Your chapter sponsored a workshop on low-cost housing and urban renewal in 1964 that pointed out the urgent need for low and moderate rent housing and coordinated professional social services in Champaign. These are incredibly necessary and important right now. Further, if any of these innovations is to be adopted, greater citizen concern must be felt and registered. An acceptance of the policy of open housing by all segments of the population, both public and private, is imperative if progress is to be made. Quotes from the 1965 report. The next one, the community report. 20 years later, the status of the Negro in Champaign County from 1968. They conducted another survey. This was more of a data presentation to find out what progress had been made to ensure equality of opportunity for all persons here locally. It was mostly a fact report. They were hoping that it would serve not only as a guide for League programs, but also as a useful tool for the community as a whole. The report detailed public education and integration efforts and failures, home financing and mortgage lending discrimination, employment and race-based underemployment figures compared to local labor market trends, health services, legal services, local local civil rights activities, Notably, in 1967, there were half as many families on the Housing Authority's waiting list than there are right now. This is precisely the kind of incomparable value that these kinds of reports and the advocacy work that you guys have done, that you ladies have done, provide to us now. This legacy is enduring, and it's really important. We can't figure out how to move forward until we know what we've already tried and where we've already failed. Case in point, Champaign's Fair Housing Ordinance is a great example for me of our local backsliding on real democratic issues. From the 1968 Community Report. On October 30th, 1968, the Champaign City Council passed the strongest municipal fair housing ordinance in the state. Fair housing boards were established in each of the 2 cities to hear complaints. In 1977, Champaign became the first city to prohibit housing discrimination on the basis of source of income, and from 1977 through 2001, refusal to rent to someone based solely on the fact that they would use a Section 8 voucher to pay part of their rent was enforced as a violation of the city ordinance. In 2001, Royce and Brinkmeyer refused to rent to a 70-year-old lady who had rented her whole life and had a spotless rental history because she had a Section 8 voucher. The Fair Housing Board hearing officer ruled against this woman, and the Human Relations Commission accepted that officer's ruling that non-discrimination did not cover Section 8 because they didn't realize they had the authority to say. That's nonsense. In 2004, a similar case came up in Chicago, which was decided in the other direction and set a precedent. So in 2006, Esther Patt, whom many of you probably know, brought the issue back before the Human Relations Commission, and the City Council voted again on this issue and specifically prohibited discrimination. We had our Fair Housing Ordinance back in 2006. A year later, in 2007, there was a City Council election in Champaign. 2 of the council members who had supported Section 8 protections were replaced by 2 who opposed them. A new city council member who requested a bill to be placed on the city council agenda, deleting the language from the ordinance, was the Southwest Champaign Council representative, Ken Purock, who then led the council in October 2007 to reverse that earlier decision. So, since 2007, it has been legal for landlords to discriminate against anyone based on source of income. Housing discrimination does not just happen, it is created, and it results in segregated, divided, unhealthy communities. In Champaign-Urbana, housing discrimination was originally created by a combination of racially restrictive covenants written into property deeds, segregated and unequal access to housing stock and quality of the type documented by the League in their shack studies and their slum clearance reports, and institutional and individual gatekeepers, UIUC, the local public housing authority, real estate agents, lending agents, local banks, and property owners and managers. Residential segregation in the US happens because of everyday activities and social norms of people as much as by law. Together with the formal practices of institutions, the informal actions of people attempting to preserve the local character of their neighborhoods play a major part in racism and in our contemporary experiences of racism. Although after 1950, no new race-restrictive covenants on property deeds were filed, segregated housing arrangements in Champaign-Urbana have persisted. The fact that there remains an association of race to the area known as the North End proves my point. Champaign-Urbana is in the middle of an affordable housing crisis right now. There are no programs or organizations in the area that create affordable rental units, either by rehabilitation or new construction, for very low or extremely low income residents, other than the local public housing authority. But the Housing Authority of Champaign County is not even coming close to meeting our community's needs. And recent changes in the way they do business has made our local housing crisis worse. Housing cost burden, which is the measure of the proportion of people's annual incomes that they spend on housing, has increased significantly since 2008. More people spend more of their incomes on housing. Fewer can afford to buy, which means that more working families are renting. In 2010, the cities of Urbana, Champaign, Rantoul, the Regional Planning Commission, and the Housing Authority came together to pay for a regional housing study done by a professional real estate market research firm from Ohio. The top 3 housing problems that firm identified were the lack of emergency shelter, especially for families, the lack of affordable rental housing units or subsidy for extremely low-income households, and opportunities for affordable homeownership. Anyone in Champaign-Urbana making less than $36,000 annually right now is categorized by HUD as very low income. Those making less than $20,000 a year are extremely low income. As a point of reference, a full-time minimum wage job in Illinois right now brings in about $17,000 a year. $10 an hour with 2 weeks off brings in about $20,000 a year. Over 50% of all workers in the US make less than $30,000 a year. The federal poverty level for a family of 5 is $28,000, and yet almost 40% of all American workers do not even bring in $20,000 a year. This should tell you something about the quality of jobs available to people right now. In Champaign, for those making between $20,000 and $35,000 a year, very low income, 73% of renters spend more than 30% of their incomes on housing. For those making less than $20,000 a year, 96% pay more than 30% of their incomes on housing. These low-income families are also the ones who have experienced the largest increase of housing costs since 2008, partially as a result of foreclosure crises, partially as a result of all political trends I'm sure you're all aware of. This means locally that for more households who could least afford it, housing got more expensive after 2008. Here in Champaign, there's a huge deficit of affordable rental units at every income level. In 2010, that real estate firm that I mentioned earlier stated that we needed over 10,000 units throughout Champaign County. The 4 biggest problems since 2008 in getting affordable homes built or rehabbed locally are: Congress has cut the overall federal funding pool by half. That sucks. Lack of private credit available to low-income groups. Private banking rules, low-income creditworthiness. There's a lot of racial trend documentation there too. And the Housing Authority of Champaign County's new role as a local developer, hoarding all state funding targeted for central Illinois. They've put 3 different small local community housing development organizations out of business in the last 4 to 5 years. They have sole ownership and control over project-based subsidies reserved for their own ongoing mixed income developments. And those developments are not serving our community's housing needs effectively. Compounding other affordability problems, the City of Champaign's current housing assistance programs make no attempt to address the local quantity of affordable housing, just the quality of what we already have. Local government provides funding for small structural improvements to homeowners, and even money to those who own multiple properties. Just over half the total residents in Champaign are homeowners. Everyone else rents. It's almost 50-50. It's a little more skewed towards ownership, but not by much. And the renter numbers are increasing. Why are those who are wealthy enough to own multiple investment properties receiving public assistance? The Housing Authority in 2010 became a moving to work agency. Since then, they've transformed into a housing manager and development partner. I'm sure you guys know or have heard about public-private partnerships. This is the direction that they have taken. They have the vast majority of state-level public funding from the Illinois Housing Development Authority tied up in their current large-scale projects underway. These projects do not just build units for our local very low-income and extremely low-income families. They are mixed income projects, which means that all federal and state funding we get for Champaign County, which the Housing Authority has sole control and discretionary power over distributing and disseminating, is now being used to build units for families who can already afford housing on the open market, those whose incomes fall at or above $58,000 a year. Let me reiterate here. The Housing Authority is literally the only organization locally that provides financial assistance for families who make below $36,000 a year. Between 2010 and 2014, the Housing Authority demolished almost a quarter of its housing stock. The majority of the housing that was demolished were those units that are in highest demand locally, the ones for families. Similar to nationwide public housing trends, Champaign is losing public housing units. As public housing units have been demolished, they are not being replaced at the same rate. This means that not only is our local housing authority not focusing its financial help towards the people who need it the most, but the housing authority is instead directing all of our local areas' federal and state housing funding towards the construction of housing that wealthier people can already afford in the private market. And locally, this is hurting our working families the most. According to the real estate market research firm I mentioned earlier, in 2010, we needed over 10,000 affordable housing units in Champaign County. In 2014, we only had 354 public housing units and only 1,500 housing vouchers. 10,000 is the need, 1,800 is the supply. And I won't even get into discussions about housing choice vouchers, which have caveats. Making things more difficult, only 18% of those who applied to receive housing vouchers were even placed on the waiting list. And the waiting list only opens up when, it doesn't open up every year, it opens up on average every 2 to 3 years, and the waiting list, the average time on the wait list that families spend on the wait list is 2 to 3 years. Even if you're one of the ones lucky enough, in the 18%, and then you wait 2 to 3 years and you get a voucher, Champaign landlords are allowed to discriminate against you and not give you housing. In my opinion, we need more sticks and fewer carrots in public policy. I see 2 primary solutions that could have a huge effect on the outcomes of our current housing crisis here locally: inclusionary zoning and annual rental property inspections for city code enforcement. Inclusionary zoning is a really powerful and completely underutilized tool that can require developers to provide a percentage of new housing units at rates affordable to low or moderate income renters or buyers if the developers decide that they want to build a luxury high-rise rental unit for students at U of I. They can do that. But if we had inclusionary zoning, it would require them to pay into an affordable housing trust fund in lieu of providing units in those new developments. Bafflingly, in Champaign's Impediments to Fair Housing report, a report required by HUD from all municipalities on a regular basis, after identifying the severity of the problem and listing these staff recommendations, very positive and potentially, I think, very effective solutions, this report concludes, if incentives continue to be sufficient to encourage voluntary construction of affordable units, no changes need be considered. This is nonsense. We're in the middle of a crisis. Clearly, there's nothing sufficient about current incentives encouraging construction of affordable units in Champaign-Urbana or in the larger county. What we need to do as citizens is demand that local agencies spend our taxpayer dollars focusing them more efficiently and being responsive to current needs rather than stuck in antiquated, false, free market definitions embedded in a racist community past. The League here has founded its now formidable reputation on protecting first-time, minority, elderly, and low-income voters and educating all people equally about the local issues that affect their lives. In the 1960s, our local chapter directed its energies to equality of opportunity and built a solid foundation of community support for equal access to education, employment, and housing. As I uncovered these local histories, housing, employment, education, and policing, all of which have racist elements to them, during my thesis research, I also uncovered the local groups and individuals like yourselves, like this organization, who worked tirelessly to stand beside and support all of those fighting for freedom and the power of self-determination. I continued through this to alternate between feelings of denial, guilt, shame, anger, grief, helplessness, and hope, a little bit of hope. My hope for the future is that we remember and that you guys help us remember, because some of you have lived through this and you know I learned an immense amount of information from sitting down for, an hour and a half with 3 women in this room. My hope is that you help us remember our past mistakes in order to learn from them and to change. I don't want to feel helpless, and I want to stand with Louise, Margaret, Liza, Marianne, Jane, Ruth, and all of you in doing our part to identify, quantify, and fight injustice. So, my question to you current members of this incredible legacy of community commitment to equality: what is the League going to do to help this elderly couple that I first spoke with in Bristol Place? I vote that we start a new committee on affordable housing and pick up where those sisters left off. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Barb. Any questions? Yes.
If we showed or demonstrated a need for 10,000 units and we have eligibility for 1,800 apparently, where do the 8,200 other need-based individuals or groups, where do they live now?
Substandard housing that isn't up to code compliance. Homelessness has risen a lot. The United Way has documented some of that in recent years. The Times Center, prisons.
I'm more concerned about families. Are they living with other families? Are we having overcrowding in the rental units?
Yeah.
Now, if you have a report saying there's no need to change, I must question, what kind of homework were they doing?
They were arguing that a single affordable development in the Ashton Park subdivision in Champaign by Atkins Group, which is full of carrot-based incentives, and it's homeownership only. So part of the problem is that both cities' programs are highly geared towards homeownership. That's a normative value, I understand that, but it's not being responsive to rental demand. In response to your question about overcrowding is definitely happening, but part of the problem is that we don't even have statistics to gauge what's happening because there's no regular rental inspection program in the city of Champaign right now.
Oh, so it seems to me that the initial thrust of the pressure for reform has to start with building code enforcement, and they can't get going until they walk the streets and ring the doorbells and count the numbers of people living in the apartment. Is that correct?
That is correct. And right now, the city of Champaign, I need to be, fair to them, there's a new code compliance officer, and he is spearheading an effort right now in Garden Hills, where they're testing a more proactive code enforcement scheme. I don't know if this is true. I think that perhaps there isn't broad council-based support. I think that if citizens decided to put this more on the public, up for discussion and advocated, that maybe council members would be pressured to support something like that. But the bottom line is they always argue cost. You would have to pay for.
This country is very good at that.
Yeah, exactly. But Urbana, in comparison, Urbana has a regular annual code inspection thing, and they had to pay for an extra code inspector, but it's built into the costs of owning rental properties in that city. And it's not unduly burdensome. It's not, you can argue that, I suppose, but yes, I think that would be a wonderful first step.
Now, who could bring that pressure to bear? Perhaps we could, but
Yes.
we're kind of old and slow, and so younger and faster.
Well, I don't know. I was thinking that your social networks here, you guys have been around, you know people. Champaign is in some ways, it's still a small place, and there are people around. I'm trying to activate students, I'm trying to activate, we've gotten together, we're trying to start an affordable housing coalition with Carol Ammon's campaign right now, with Habitat for Humanity, with Homestead Corporation, which is the only local affordable community housing developer that serves this kind of income demographic. So I'm working with 2 other students, and we're trying to kind of galvanize different stakeholder groups. I'm really hoping that you guys will be one of them. But I have lots of ideas I could. Yes. Yes, Louise.
First, Natalie, let me say thank you for the kind words.
Thank you for your time.
And actually, Maureen McCord, who just asked you a series of questions, is one of the people you probably should have met before. She is also a very long time and very knowledgeable leaguer. I have 2 questions, one of which is current and immediate, if you will. I keep noticing these huge apartment buildings that are being built in the campus area, and I keep having people who know the campus area very well say that they don't know whether those are ever going to be completely filled. I would like to know your knowledge of that and your views on the future of those huge buildings. Obviously, they don't respond to the immediate problem that you're addressing very adroitly, but do they offer any prospects of hope, I guess,
No is the short answer. And the reason, the reason is, and I didn't have time to get into this, but the reason is that the student market here skews, obviously, the local rental market hugely. And the demographics of U of I students has shifted a lot recently. The U of I has created value capture educational programs for specifically international students that can afford, so those are being geared towards a very different market. And that particular market trend is clearly adversely affecting local working families, people, so that's why I really would love to see this inclusionary zoning stuff happen. And that is another push that I think you guys could be really important and vital in. I think it needs to happen. I think we need to raise an outcry publicly, and people need to understand more what options are actually available to us, because it's not clear to me that either city governments are very transparent about the fact that they're offering thousands of dollars in property tax abatements. You know, we're losing tax dollars on luxury rental developments when we should, and not getting anything in return. So.
My other remark has to do with a suggestion for the list of leaguers that you mentioned early on. Since I was in part responsible for that list, I must ask you to add two more to it.
Excellent.
One is Helen Levin,
Okay.
who is still alive and with us at age almost 104.
Wow.
Who was
That's
president
amazing.
of this league, president of the State of
Oh,
Illinois
wow.
League, and treasurer of the League of Women Voters of the United States. And I firmly believe would have been national president had it not been for what proved to be fatal illness of her husband Ezra. She certainly should be included as someone who brought a great deal of the attention of this league 50, 60 years ago to its to the lamentable conditions in which people were living in our area. And the other is Betty Levin.
Okay.
Betty Lazarus, Mrs. David Lazarus, who is unfortunately no longer with us, but who was engaged for many years in social issues in Champaign-Urbana and did a great deal of.
I think I've seen her name actually. I did a lot of newspaper archive research too. I remember that name. Okay.
So
That's
please
great.
add those-
Thank you. I will.
those
I
names
will.
to
Yes,
the
I
list.
will.
I don't know why we missed them.
Sorry.
How much is Habitat filling?
So Habitat is Habitat is hard because it's great, they're wonderful, but they're able to be their own lender because they have, their own funding pool, but they only target the population of people who can afford a mortgage, who can afford homeownership. And because that is declining, the need that I see and the need that I would like to see us focus on, because the biggest need that I see is people who don't qualify for mortgage loans, for private lending, even for Habitat loans sometimes. Homestead Corporation, like I said, is one of the only other local community housing development organizations here locally, and speaking with the director of that program as part of my research was enlightening. It's kind of like Habitat serves this population of middle income but mortgage eligible families. Homestead is like a slight overlap to that, and they have some assistance for homeless and for even lower income, but they also are constrained by the Illinois Housing Development Authority's funding restrictions. Often what Homestead has been doing is packaging development proposals, trying to get funding for specific special needs groups, the disabled, the elderly. So if they can advocate that one of their projects is going to serve a different need than what the Housing Authority, for instance, currently has going on, then they have a better chance at receiving some funding assistance. But right now, the biggest problem that everyone is experiencing locally is that there's not a lot of funding, which is why I think developer-led, these people are making bank in this town on rental properties. There are tons of people who are making lots of money and they're not sharing any of it. There's no reciprocity and there's no investment in the local community. And that's, I guess, the emphasis that I kind of would like to see is people investing in the local community and investing in making things better for everyone, not just for themselves and pocketing all the profits.
I think it's too easy to say that the problem is just for people of color.
I agree.
Because in Champaign County, the largest population is not people of color.
I agree.
It's white people. And the real problem that I see, and my sister was a great example of this, is single women head of household with children.
Yeah. The family, right.
I helped her look for an apartment now for 4 months. The only one that she can afford on her low income, that she received some time work and another part-time job that she has, is $475 a month. A one-bedroom apartment, so my nephew's gonna have to take me over. It's 475 square feet. The landlord will pay the water
I agree.
What I think has to be a part of your coalition is Land of Lincoln, Legal Assistance Foundation,
Yep.
because they have done all the important litigation on predatory lending and mortgage foreclosure suits for the last 35, 40 years now.
Yeah.
We need to have domestic violence shelters involved in this because they're the ones that are providing
Women in
all the
transition,
temporary
yeah.
housing,
Yeah. I hear
for
you.
women in crisis
Mhm.
and transitional housing because that's now part of their mission too, and they're being chopped off the crap at the state level.
Yeah.
And you also need to reach out to the single women head of household groups that work with them. Family Service of Champaign County and other social service organizations who are the only, honestly, the only thing that keeps a lot of those folks, and that includes township
Presence.
assistants and some other folks like that too.
Yeah.
Is the difference between living on the street and finding someplace to live.
Yeah.
But it's ridiculous.
I know.
that
It's
this is
appalling.
the best that I could find for her, instead of having her come live with me, which I would have been happy with, but she would have had a cow. Oh, I didn't know sisters after all. But it's, here she is 54 years old, and
Yeah.
this is what she can afford in this community.
Yeah, it's not right.
And she doesn't have a car payment, because there's no car. You know, we're talking about somebody who is living a very basic life, and this is what you get, in Champaign, Urbana. So.
I hear you. Those are all really good suggestions. I appreciate you saying that. We literally have a list of, community organizations. I hadn't even thought of women in transition. I hadn't thought, so that, yeah, we're gonna,
And I also.
it's on the list.
And frankly, the other big population now is addressed by, the Immigration Center.
Mhm.
Our bigger burgeoning population, is also Hispanic.
Right.
Larger than the African American population. It's been that way now for the last 20 years.
Mhm.
So, bad housing is all over Champaign County, not just in the north end
Yeah.
of Champaign, Urbana. It's everywhere. So until we can address that as a community-wide solution, we are not going to get anywhere. And that's just a fact.
Yeah, I agree. Yes.
Is the focus of the local housing authority unique, or is it a national trend to follow the kind of, approach that they're taking to providing housing?
I would say there are elements of both as a non-answer. This moving to work idea is a national trend. The way that individual local housing authorities, the idea is that local housing authorities have more discretion and less HUD oversight for implementing unique housing solutions for their own communities. That additional flexibility ends up depending entirely on the Board of Commissioners in the local area, the current housing markets, the conditions.
Be more focused
They
on
could
lower income
be
than what they're
incredibly,
doing.
yes,
And
yes.
that's something that we can.
And that's something we can advocate. I mean, I need to start, and one of the things on my list of things to do is to start showing up at the Board of Commissioners Housing Authority meetings on a regular basis. I interviewed a couple of them as part of my thesis, but, it was one piece of this gigantic Gordian knot, and, I was only able as a student to devote a certain amount of time. So this is a good question. This is kind of the Housing Authority, looking at supply, looking at incentives and policy. These are kind of, just things that I would like to, I think would be effective, but so, yes.
Did you mention that you were speaking with some students at the university about mobilizing people?
Yeah.
What are the names of them? Do you have a class of people who you've been speaking to? Those students?
I mean, there are other urban planning students in my department, one of whom is in my PhD cohort incoming. He just finished his master's this month, and the other one is entering his second year of the master's. So we've all kind of been part of a student, coalition in our department who are trying to, we're trying to coordinate with other groups on campus. We're trying to get more students outside of our department involved. But we'd love to have you if you're interested in being.
I'm very involved with the activism at UIUC
Okay.
community, and a lot of my closest friends, peers, colleagues, classmates are very involved and like to raise awareness of those issues that are going on not just national scale, but of course local. And if you need people to go to the housing authority meetings and
We're going to exchange contact info. I love it. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's going to be great because honestly, getting undergrads involved is a huge goal of ours too. Master's students are only around for 2 years, and it's sometimes hard to have continuity with this kind of effort. That's great.
So if I could just interrupt for a minute, for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to meet Rose Rodriguez is our new student intern. So we definitely expect that the lead chapter on campus will be front and center in this issue.
That's great. Yeah.
You mentioned Bristol Place.
Mm-hmm.
The plan, I heard sometime back, and I kind of forget, that area is not going to be developed just for low income living.
No.
It's going to be a mix of, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
The stage that the city of Champaign is at right now, they just sent out a request for qualifications for a developer. So they just came up with a list that they have released for what they'd like to see go back into the new into the development. It's my understanding, based on my research, that they're focusing on LEED and D criteria, energy efficiency, which by definition is not affordable, mixed income, low income housing tax credit complexes have been very successful in the city of Champaign. Housing Authority and the cities, both Urbana and Champaign, have partnered on the recent developments. Douglas Square, the ones on Bradley that now look all pretty when you drive by. The new ones I was mentioning, Providence at Thornberry and Southwest Champaign, Providence at Sycamore. A lot of people in town, I think, see as very successful. I think that that's what their goal is, but I don't know. We're still, we're tracking, we're kind of monitoring. I'm in touch with Carrie Spear, the head of neighborhood services. I'm in touch with Kevin Jackson, actually he's the director of neighborhood services. So, I'm monitoring things, but that's the short answer. We don't know yet. They have visuals available online on the City of Champaign website that show very pretty, green Douglas Square looking kind of layout and design, but they're, those are all just concept drawings, so they don't know yet.
So, can you explain to me the economy of low-income housing? Because if there's no profit in it, we're asking people with money, I don't belong to the 1%. We're asking people with money to come in and build very good buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like if they were energy efficient, they would have to be even better constructed in a better. And yet the return on their dollar, they cannot rent these for $1,100 a month. It has to be $475.
Mm-hmm.
There's no subsidies because people have gone out of that business. How is it economically possible for someone to put up low-income, well-constructed buildings, especially if they won't take Section 8 vouchers? Because at least Section 8 vouchers
Help pay the rent, right?
Sort of market value for your rental, right?
This is a Yeah, this is a really good question. This is like the crux of the issue, and I am not a market, and this is what I'm going into my PhD to study and learn more about. So that caveat being said, I don't think that it's either the right direction or a reasonable, realistic direction to think about building only affordable housing complexes for the exact reasons that you just stated. Exactly. That's the whole move in the 80s to get to this mixed income development move, was a response to the concentrated poverty, the concentrated, issues. So I don't think that's realistic. What I do think is realistic is having developers accept a slightly lower return on investment for their developments in exchange for other incentives offered by local government, I don't know, property, the property tax things maybe. There are already a number of incentives that the cities each have discretionary power over that they're already offering these developers. And the developers' ROIs are staying at a level that is very high. You can still have a positive ROI on a project. You can still make a profit. It just won't be as big. And the other thing that I think is important here, and I don't, again, have the specific details off the top of my head, but there's the low-income housing tax credits. That it's a federal program, and there's something about developers who build low-income housing tax credit complexes get federal funding, either as a tax rebate or as a, like they get to write off some amount as a result of doing that kind of construction. So HUD has been trying to come up with creative financial strategies to do exactly what you're doing, to make it more to create financial incentives built into trying to bridge this gap between the private market and the public, building this kind of stuff. So there's a need. ROIs aren't high enough. Private developers will never do it on their own. They need incentives. How can we make ROIs still reasonable? How can people still make money and do well, which is a great thing. Obviously that builds economies. That's important. To me, we're too far in one direction. There's room to move, the other way, and still all hopefully, I don't know. You had a hand up for a while.
This is just about stakeholders, particularly between Champaign and Urbana is the elephant in the room, the university. I know the students are working on putting the coalition together. Is there any need for the university's muscle to help out and do something for the communities that they straddle and take advantage of and
profit off of? I mean, I would say absolutely. Clearly, you probably know my political position at this point, but yes, I do think that there's room for that. I have to say that my experience with the university administration, especially recently, has been mostly through the Graduate Employees Organization, and they are remarkably difficult. Thank you. Yes, that word. It's hard to get that. I mean, honestly, I think that community pressure, trustee pressure, and moneyed interests around town pressure would do a heck of a lot more in making the university have any movement than any students. My 2 cents.
students are transit.
Exactly. And they don't get, a lot of them don't get it. They're not from here. They don't, look at this stuff to the degree.
Natalie, I have 2 comments on that. One is, they come to the same thing, however. One of the things that you're writing right now, which I hope will receive a lot of public attention, is likely to have, and that goes back to the League shack studies and so forth. It's a dreadful thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that embarrassing people does get their attention. And one of the things that the League is quite good at, when it wants to do it, is embarrassing public officials and business people and so forth, simply by saying, here it is, how do you like it, to the public. So that,
and you guys have such a good position to do that from.
Yes, I have a granddaughter who is a good League member, I'm happy to say, in Santa Barbara, California, one of the richest counties in the United States, as I'm sure you know, who is an attorney and does a great deal of pro bono work for the homeless, believe it or not, in that rich county. She also has learned the value of embarrassment, and one of the things that she does almost every month is have some remark to make to her county board, to the city council or whatever, which is likely to get on the front page or at least in the paper, that says something about what needs to be done for the homeless in Santa Barbara County. So think about that.
Yeah, tweets.
I'm old enough that I can say that and hope that no one will throw anything at me.
I appreciate that. That's excellent. Oh, yes.
Recently, we've gotten involved with trying to find some low-income housing for people, and we've run into what's called, I think, subsidized housing.
Mhm.
There are apartment buildings in almost every city in Champaign County. How does that fit into what you've been describing to us tonight?
Are they in, do you know if the subsidized housing are in complexes that have tax credits attached to them? That's my
No.
first guess.
I don't know. I do know that what they do procedurally is to have you pay a percentage of your income.
Yeah, those are vouchers. I think.
Yeah,
I don't
there's a long
know.
waiting
You know.
list and there was
Yeah,
something about a
yeah.
voucher.
Those are Section 8 housing choice vouchers. So the way that those work is the idea behind them is that a family can afford 30% of their income on housing, and the difference between that amount, whatever it is for the family, and the market rent for that unit is then paid, is the amount that that voucher is good for that particular family. And, you know, the idea is that it's supposed to expand housing choice, and there are all these, you know, wonderful arguments about where you can use them and how they're going to be great, and that is a very wrought argument. I don't know. I want to learn more about that too. But so yeah, my guess would be housing choice vouchers.
One more question.
Okay, I just want to make a comment and then ask you a question, Natalie. Among the many devastating impacts of inadequate low-income housing is what it does to kids in school.
Yeah.
Champaign, well, Urbana, I should say, I know more about Urbana than Champaign, has one of the highest mobility rates, which is the number of kids that move in and out of the school district each year. It's well over the national average, well into the 20%, which means, a fifth of the kids every year are moving in and out of classrooms, and mostly it's because the families are in search of adequate housing. I mean, it's almost largely the case. They go back and forth between Champaign and Urbana, Rantoul, Danville, where they can get, housing. And I think our the report to the board this year was that there's 100 families homeless in Urbana. That's out of 4,000 kids, 100 families who are homeless this year, and that's up, I think, a quarter from last year. I mean, the numbers keep going up.
Yeah.
So I mean, what it does to kids and
Yeah.
families, of course, but kids' education prospects are just, torn
Yeah.
apart when they can't, go to school.
The numbers are roughly proportional in the Champaign school district.
Are they? Okay.
Yeah.
But my question, which isn't really related to kids, but this inclusionary zoning idea that you talk about, I know you said Champaign doesn't have it. Does Urbana have it, or how prevalent is it among city governments to have inclusionary zoning?
That's a good question. So with my master's thesis, I had to narrow in order to fit it into 300 pages. So the depth that I've shared with you is it's almost all on City of Champaign. So I haven't done the level of research on Urbana, so I can't answer the question about what kind of inclusionary zoning they use at the City of Urbana. Yeah. I could direct you to someone who would have that answer.
Is something that's a reasonable thing to ask, do other municipalities have this, or is this something that's still so experimental that it's not,
Also a good question. It's not experimental. It's been around for a long time. The frequency or prevalence with which actual municipalities use it now, I think it varies a lot. I don't know. It's kind of like TIF districts. It sounds really good in some ways when it's pitched in a certain way, but then in practice, you have to get around other policies that are overlapped and entwined. And so, I don't know. Is the short? I'm not sure.
It's good to know about that.
Yeah. This is part of. I want to expand the work that I've done and include Urbana, because in a lot of ways, the main comparison that I did in Urbana was the code compliance stuff. So I have pages and a chapter in my thesis about proactive code enforcement and code compliance versus not proactive. And that was the Urbana-Champaign comparison, and that was kind of the main one that I focused on. So I don't know. But